The member for Dawson.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And rising to speak on this Schools Assistance Bill, I am reminded of the purpose behind our education system. Regardless of how we build the system and how we operate the system, the desired outcome remains the same: to help future generations to learn. And following the member for Riverina's comments, I just want to actually endorse some of those remarks that he said at the end in regards to Catholic schools and private schools. I've always been of the belief that the taxpayer funds are for the children, for the students, and it really should not matter which school that they attend. But every bill that comes before this parliament should in some way enhance the education outcomes and the outcomes of future generations' learning. And I'm talking about all students here. And I believe that the coalition amendments to this bill will do that. But we can't expect our children to learn if the system's builders and operators demonstrate a fundamental inability to learn. If they are unable to learn the easiest lessons of all, and that is learning from one's mistakes, such a flaw would undermine the system. It would undermine the outcomes. It would deliver for future generations a standard lower than they actually deserve. What we have in this bill before us is a warning that the current government is just simply not capable of learning from its own mistakes. It's not for the want of an opportunity. They've created more than a fair share of their learning opportunities or mistakes. Amongst an extensive back catalogue of these learning opportunities, we find familiar themes. There are common threads. These threads suggest that if only a small number of lessons could be learnt by the government, a large number of the future stuff-ups could be avoided. The troubling thing is this: we can see the problems coming. We can see that the national curriculum and how it is going to be implemented has not been properly thought through. We know what happens as a result because we've seen it happen one too many times with this current government. It's troubling because we can see it coming, but the government can't. It's like the passenger in a car doing 200 kilometres an hour who can see the approaching cliff, but the driver's too busy looking in the vanity mirror. It's troubling because we can see yet another knee-jerk reaction in the pipeline. We can see a government going off half-cocked because they are so desperate to make it look like they've actually done something. So desperate, in fact, that they don't even wait until the job is half done before claiming that it's finished. With this Schools Assistant Amendment Bill in mind, I might remind the House that the Prime Minister said on July the 2nd last year that this nation's talked about national curriculum for 30 years. I delivered it. That was more than a year ago. There is still nothing delivered, and that's why we are here, debating this bill almost 14 months later, and implementation still a speck on the future horizon. In addition to delayed delivery, the Coalition also has serious concerns about exactly what is being delivered and how it's going to be delivered. And that's why we've moved important amendments that we can hope stop this runaway car before it reaches the cliff. We need the government to not only allow input from the appropriate sources, but to listen to that input, to take in advice and admit to themselves that people and organisations outside the Labor Party and the Greens, people working in the education system and with the education system, might actually know what they are talking about, because what this government thinks it is going to deliver as a national curriculum is nothing to skite about. It's something that should be cause for deep embarrassment. The Coalition believes that a delay is necessary. That's why we've sought previously to pass a similar bill. A delay in implementation of the national curriculum is necessary because it could be a very, very, very long time before this government could get the national curriculum right. The implementation of this national curriculum has all the loose threads, all the warning signs, all the hallmarks of the multitude of miserable failures this government should have learnt from. This government should have learnt that what happens when you make promises you're not capable of delivering is something like the failed Computers in Schools program. There was a strong parallel between the Prime Minister claiming a year ago that she had delivered a national curriculum and the promise that computers would be delivered to every high school student by the end of 2011. In June this year, only 55% of the computers had been rolled out, and that took 3 years to do. That was leaving the government another 6 months to roll out the remaining 45%, which the member for Riverina here reminds me is missing. But that is never going to happen. Even the Education Department knows that's not going to happen. The problem is they never told the Minister for Education that it wasn't going to happen, because a month later the Minister was still telling us the program was on track and on schedule. It is a proven track record of inability to deliver. But here we are, bragging about having delivered a national curriculum that is still miles away from completion. The government should have learnt that what happens when you don't fully think things through, you end up with a debacle, like the overpriced school halls that picked the pockets of Australian taxpayers and ripped off state government schools. Did anyone ever sit down and think about how these school halls would be delivered? Who would build them? How they would build them? How they would price them? How fair value would be measured? The result is a disastrous waste of money. Money that should have created much greater benefit for our education system. But here we are, skirting about having delivered a national curriculum where there is still no real plan as to how it's going to be delivered. The government should have learnt that what happens when you don't consider implications of a shoddy implementation plan is a pink bat scheme. If you create an environment where people are not properly trained for what they're supposed to do, not given clear guidelines on how to perform the task, not given the support they need to do their job, you have to expect a degree of failure. That should have been a lesson learnt from the Pink Bats program. But here we are, putting together a national curriculum content that will have teachers ill-equipped for implementation. They will be overwhelmed with the size and scope of this task. There is an inadequate provision for training and support, and there is a distinct lack of clear guidelines to follow. The government should have learnt that what happens when you are led down the garden path by a minority interest, you lose sight of the big picture. You end up pandering to a single entity with a minority viewpoint. You end up pushing pokies legislation that's hated by millions of people just to garner the vote of a single person. But here we are, creating content that is so ideologically skewed that it pushes every cultural context except reality. The national curriculum, in its current form, goes to great lengths to add weight to minority views, to Indigenous culture, to Asian culture, but without equal weight for the dominant British heritage and Judeo-Christian traditions on which this country was founded. Now, I'm not opposed to including such content in the curriculum. Indigenous culture is a very important component of Australian culture. Our country's geographical ties to Asia also need to be recognised, but these influences must be viewed as they are in the real world, through the framework of our overwhelming British heritage and dominant Judeo-Christian traditions. These are the foundations of Australian society. They are the foundations of the world our children live in. They are the foundations that have built our language, the language that our teachers will be using to educate our children. To ignore these foundations would be no less a failure than to completely ignore Indigenous and Asian culture. These concerns about the content of the national curriculum are not just concerns held by the Coalition. They are views shared by key stakeholders. I point to Dr Kevin Donnelly, the Director of Melbourne-based Education Standards Institute, and he said that he too could see this coming. I can see that my fears about the new curriculum were well-founded, he said. He describes the content as a heady mixture of politically correct perspectives, sustainable Indigenous, feminist, class, postmodern and cultural relativist. He shares the view that it is only through the context of our Western heritage that we can understand our legal system, our political system, our language, our literature and our education. We have to question why someone would sit down developing a national curriculum that goes to great lengths to ignore the terms BC and AD to indicate years, simply because BC stands before Christ. Well, we mustn't mention the C word. No, they thought it would be better to use the term BCE, before Common Era. That's rewriting history at its best. Not content with rewriting history, this government is supporting a national curriculum that gives a fantastic outline of the Labor Party, but conveniently neglects balancing the outlines of the Liberal and National parties. That is serious. That is in the national curriculum. Perhaps if the people on the ground were given the opportunity for input, and the government took the time to put their ego in a box long enough to listen to what people were saying, they would avoid such an embarrassment. Mr Deputy Speaker, the government should have learnt, and they still aren't listening to what people are saying about the carbon tax, and it just makes people angry, and we saw it today, makes people more determined to force an election by any means possible. They need to avoid that personality flaw here and allow for more voices into the national curriculum formulation. In the time afforded by the extension of this deadline, the government should accept their own shortcomings and actively seek advice from those who really do know better, including a representative from the non-government schools on the Australian Education, Early Childhood Development and Youth Affairs Senior Officials Committee would be a very, very good start. Yep. Because so much of the future depends on our education system. Yep. The lives of generations to come will be hugely shaped by the education that we provide now for our young people. It is of great concern to me that such an important part of society is now in the hands of this government, Labor and the Greens, who clearly demonstrate that they are most incapable of learning themselves. And I really do hope, Mr Speaker, that this curriculum is delayed so that we can have some balance, we can get it right. So if we do not get this right, it will not be the government that suffers, it will be the children. That is, until we reach the ballot box. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker.
Good. Thank you for your contribution.